Hey guys, so today's live stream is brought to you by Devereux Advanced Behavioral Network. I lived there from at the Devereux Advanced Behavioral Network, um, Victoria, Texas location from 2011 to 2014. And all I can say is that it literally was It literally was, it literally made my life a living hell. There were, there was an employee of that, there was an employee of that, there were employees of that facility that were domestic violent, that perpetrated domestic violence against the people who live there. And, if you've ever, if you've ever, if you've ever witnessed, if you've ever witnessed domestic violence firsthand, you'll know what I mean, especially if you're a person with a learning disability who's been a victim of domestic violence. And I was a victim of domestic violence at Devereux. And I would not recommend, I would not recommend, um, I would not recommend this place for anyone because because there are employees there that are very unpredictable and very abusive and who will treat and like Devereaux literally treated me like I was the lowest form of life. Like Devereaux literally treated me like I was literally life unworthy of life and like I was literally subhuman. And like I said, Deborah literally treated me like I was life unworthy of life, and like I was also subhuman. And what was even worse is is the place I was going to high school at the time, which was Austin Westlake High School. They literally condoned and encouraged it, and I literally took it personal. You know, I really did take it personal. I literally took it personal, and it made me so angry that even now I wish I had said something, and that I had lodged, and I even now, I wish I had lodged a complaint against Devereaux, and that I just wish that I had said something to somebody. But the only problem was at the time is that I was afraid to say something to somebody because of the fear I was the fear that Westlake High School would tell me to keep my mouth shut and not criticize this wonderful place you're at, and that basically I would get that basically what would have happened is that Westlake High School would have just slapped me across the face. Would have just is that what would have happened is that Westlake High School, like I said, Westlake High School would have just slapped me across the face and told me and would have just told me that if I couldn't say nice things, just to keep my mouth shut. And unfortunately, At the time, it was the people at Devereux who couldn't say nice things. That's what I realize now is that it was the people at Devereux who couldn't say nice things. So the people at Devereux were the ones who needed to keep their mouths shut. So, you know, I hate to say it, but it is what it is. I mean, what most people don't realize, is it's like it's their house of it was their household. It was Devereaux's house of horrors. I mean, it's basically where this long cycle of abuse that's haunted my adult life began. Devereaux is pretty much where I learned a lot of my abusive behaviors. And if there was ever any defense of my future abusive behaviors towards my future group home staff, Devereux was it. Devereux was where I learned was where I learned the majority of those behaviors. And honestly, you know, to tell my audience the truth, you know, to tell my audience the truth, you know, being perpetrating domestic violence against my future group home staff was really the only real way I actually knew how to deal with. I actually was the only real way I actually knew how to deal with people that were, you know, that were committing crimes against me. Because the sad reality is that as I got older, I realized that that other providers that I had later on, as that when I first got back to Denton, the first provider I had back when I got back to the Denton area was doing the same stuff that Devereux did, and I just wasn't gonna stand for it, and so I had to take action before you know that before I had to take action for before before Avid, which was the first provider I had, the first the first HCS provider I had when I got back here to Den, ultimately folded on me. I mean, it's like I couldn't just sit by and watch. Yeah, I couldn't watch Avid do the same shit Devereaux did. I mean, if my audience thinks that I was gonna sit by and watch Avid do the same shit Devereaux did, my audience is clearly mistaken. What my audience has to realize is that the first house manager I had at Avid, which was Courtney, Avid clearly thought that Courtney was like so much better. Like Avid clearly thought that Courtney was like so much better than all the other house managers at Avid, which clearly he was not. One way that Avid thought Courtney was so much better than everybody else was the fact that they thought he could get away with violating the state's COVID protocol, which he could not do. And all I had to do was put in a phone call. It was just put in a phone call to the Department of Health and Human Services and Courtney would have lost his job, would have been deemed unfit to work in the to work in places like Avid. And so it was like being at Avid was just it was just a nightmare. It was so much worse than being at Devereux. And then the place I was at after I left Avid was so much worse than Avid. It was literally like on a scale of on a scale of 1 to 10, it was a 10 plus. It was a 10 plus, meaning it was like uh, like like if I could rate innovative steps on a scale of 1 to 10, I would give it a 1.5. Meaning it was just a nightmare. Meaning it, and also meaning it was like my worst nightmare come true. And for those of you who think that, for those of you who think that like people can get away with mistreating people with learning disabilities, my audience is clearly wrong. The Americans with Disabilities Act, you know, can mean, the Americans with Disabilities Act literally means that that a county judicial system I should say, literally means a federal judicial system can prosecute, can prosecute a disability caregiver um, for for mistreating people who can't defend themselves. And judges do not take kindly to people who can't to mistreat people who can't defend themselves. So I'm just saying, like the people at Devereux who were mistreated when I was there, the Americans with Disabilities Act can have those people prosecuted. And all I can say is like the person that I knew at Devereux that mistreated the people that mistreated the people that that mistreated me and my roommates when I was there, she wouldn't last if she was prosecuted by a federal judge. She wouldn't last very long. She would not last very long behind bars unless she was sent to a Federal Bureau of Prisons administrative facility where she could be kept. And yeah, I mean, and what this means is like, um, unless my ex caregiver Trisha was prosecuted by a federal judge and sent to like a Federal Bureau of Prisons administrative facility um, where she could be where she could be kept in a single person cell and could be where she could be kept in like a single person cell and given limited privileges, because in when you're in prison you don't have rights, because what you have my audience has to for members of my audience who don't know, in prison you don't have rights, you have privileges, and that's for both county, state, and federal prison. In county, state, and federal prison, you don't have rights. You have privileges. So the only privileges that my ex caregiver Trisha Ross would get when she got to when she got to, because because from what I'm aware of, the nearest Federal Bureau of Prisons administrative facilities that are closest to Denton are Federal Medical Center Carswell, and Federal Medical Center Fort Worth. Federal Medical Center Fort Worth being for male inmates, and Federal Medical Center Carswell being for female inmates. So most likely my ex-caregiver Patricia Ross would end up at Federal Medical Center Carswell, which is on the which is located on the premises of Carswell Air Force Base. And the only privileges in the in my ex when my ex caregiver when the federal judge prosecuting my ex caregiver Patricia Ross found out what she did, he or she would make sure that that once my ex caregiver Patricia Ross got to Federal Medical Center Carswell, the federal judge prosecuting my ex-caregiver Patricia Ross would make sure that my ex-caregiver Patricia Ross would get very few privileges. The only privileges I know for a fact my ex-caregiver Patricia Ross would get is a single person cell, 23 hours of lock, 20 basically like and also up to 24 hours of lockdown, and commissary, and also no commissary, no phone calls, and no visitations, and maybe one letter to family and friends like every 2 weeks, and maybe one letter if ever to family and friends, maybe perhaps once a month, if perhaps every 2 weeks. So, when you're in county, state, or federal prison, a judge can limit your privileges. And for the most, and for who end up in prison for assaulting people who can't defend themselves, judges can limit your privileges. Judges can make sure you get put in a single person cell and can strip you of your most basic privileges to include how much rec time you get and whether you even get commissary or not. It's very likely my ex caregiver Patricia Ross would not even get commissary. It's most when she got to Federal Medical Center Carswell, it's a very good possibility my ex caregiver Patricia Ross would not even get commissary, let alone let alone recreation time. It's a very good possibility my ex caregiver Trish Ross would be locked down 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, and would possibly only get commissary once a month if ever, and would only get commissary and perhaps would only get commissary once a month, would possibly only get commissary every 2 weeks, if perhaps once a month, and would only get maybe two visitations a month from family and friends, if only one visitation a month from family and friends. And it would have to be like one of those no contact visitations, like for my audience members who have never seen like about prison, have never seen like TV shows or movies about prison, like those what a no contact visitation is it's basically like where they have where county, state, and federal prisons have a a basically a large pane of glass separating the inmate and his or her family or friends. And they basically have to pick up like a telephone. They basically have to pick up, some have like a microphone, some others have a telephone that you have to pick up to talk to your family or friends. It's basically how county, state, and federal prisons do no contact visitation. Like, I don't know if any of my audience members have ever seen that movie Escape from Alcatraz with Clint Eastwood, but but like there's basically a scene where they actually show what a no contact visitation looks like. It's basically where you basically walk up to this pane of glass that separates you and your family and your visiting friend or relative. And basically, like, in some cases, there's an actual microphone that extends out to where you can talk to your friend or relative. Sometimes there's not even a microphone. Sometimes there's like a little phone. Sometimes there's like a little phone you have to pick up to talk to your friend or relative, and um, it's all recorded by the prison guards and the warden. And then for phone calls, like uh, sometimes like judges can even inform the warden of the state of the county, state, or federal prison that can even like inform the warden of the county, state, or federal prison how many phone whether you even have phone call privileges or not. And I highly doubt that once again, I highly doubt my ex caregiver, Patricia Ross, if she ended up in federal prison, would even get phone call privileges, if ever. She'd probably only get to make two phone calls. At best, she would probably only get to make two phone calls a month to family and friends, if ever. And basically, if you get to make, if she did get to make phone calls ever, basically what you have to do is it's basically you would have to like dial the number, you pick up the phone. In prison, you dial the number, you pick up the phone, and it's basically all recorded. And it's all phone calls in county, state, and federal prison are all recorded and stored in a database. So are and yeah, and so basically when like every time from what I've heard, every time you make a phone call in county, state, or federal prison, you have to it's all stored and like it's all recorded and stored in like a special database. So pretty much every time a county, state, or an inmate in a county, state, or federal prison makes a phone call, it's all recorded and stored in a database. It doesn't matter who you call. It's all recorded and stored in a database. And so it's all recorded and stored in a database. And it's all recorded and stored in a database. And so the prison officials will literally know every phone call you make to somebody, and so like it they'll pretty much know every phone call you make to somebody, and so like they'll pretty much know FM's Federal Medical Center Carswell will pretty much know every phone call my ex caregiver Patricia Ross will make to somebody, and so like um they'll pretty much know every phone call my ex caregiver Patricia Ross makes to somebody, and so so basically like